And so I was going to look just briefly, just get you thinking about the idea of ethnicity in education. Okay, so in Unit 2, we're looking at all sorts of theories about education and factors that play a part. And up until recently, we've been looking at, and if you've managed to watch the videos that I put on YouTube, we've been looking at things like, are schools equal? Do we live in a meritocracy? You know, are the best people getting to the top? Or are there other factors that affect achievement? And so we've been thinking about things like social class and things like that. Here, we're going to look at ethnicity, okay? Does ethnicity play a part in achievement in schools? And if so, why? So one of the common things about ethnicity is it comes with a whole bunch of assumptions, which generally are incorrect. When we see people, for example, skin color as a marker of ethnicity, is commonly it commonly leads us to make mistaken assumptions about people. One of the classic things would be if someone came up to someone in a school or a college near you and said, "Oh, where do you and your family come from then?" If your skin color was different, and you might say, "Cardiff," because that might be where you're from. And so what this does is it raises all sorts of questions about what does ethnicity mean, especially to the people who might have it. And the answer is everyone's got an ethnicity. Okay, so here's a series of questions that we might ask ourselves. So where do you come from? So you might say from the valleys, or you might say from Cardiff, or you might say from Wales, or you might say from the United Kingdom, or you might say from the Northern Hemisphere, or you might say from planet Earth. Okay, it's interesting though, isn't it? You might say from, you know, like me, from Essex, England. Billericay was where I was born. Okay, but what would I say? So partly that might depend on who I'm talking to, who's asking. If it's an American, would they know Billericay in Essex? Okay, so I might just say, "Oh, I'm from Britain, I'm from the UK." What answer do you give to people who live in the same town? Okay, assuming you live in a town. If you live in a village, substitute village. What answer do you give to people who live in the same place as you when they say, "Where do you come from?" Is it a different answer to the people who live in the same region? Okay, so they don't live in the same town or village as you, but they live in the same region. Do you give a different answer then? So if I meet someone from my town, I say, "Well, I'm from here." But if I meet someone from a different town, do I say the different town name? What answer do you give people who live in London when they say, "Where do you come from?" Do you say Wales, Wales? Come round, Biff. What answer do you give to people who live in a foreign country? England doesn't count, although actually, no, it does actually. What answer do you give though? So where do you come from? Isn't a simple question. Okay, and essentially it's based on ethnicity. Now, ethnicity is a blend of a number of different factors, normally UK, okay. It's a blend of factors, and everyone has an ethnicity, okay. And it's surprising the number of people who aren't quite sure what their ethnicity actually is, all right. What we're interested in is what are the effects of ethnicity on educational attainment? Does your cultural background impact on your attainment in education? Does it matter? Because it shouldn't do, should it? If we've got equality of opportunity, then everyone should have an equal chance in the education system. So your ethnicity shouldn't make any difference. Does it though? Okay. So what we're going to look for is ethnicity a variable affecting educational attainment? And the answer is yes, but we want to try and find out why. We want to make note of some minority ethnic groups achieve significantly better than the average. And we want to ask ourselves why. Why is that linked to ethnicity? And then the other thing is then other ethnic groups appear to be disadvantaged by education systems in the UK. And so again, we want to ask ourselves why? How is that happening and what can we do about it? We want to look at some statistics, okay? On paper 2, which you won't be sitting this year, but it's good to know anyway, we get some statistical information that we have to be able to interpret it. So that's actually a useful skill to be able to look at graphs and make sense of them. So let's look at ethnicity. So what does it mean? So Ethnicity means you belong to a group that shares some similar characteristics, like your country of origin, or a similar language, or a similar religion, or a similar ancestry, or a similar culture. Also, ethnicity can be defined by biology, but it doesn't have to be. And it can be defined by history. It's not necessarily changed by the culture that a person grows up in. Okay. So this guy, you might have heard of. I think he's almost retired now. When I first made this, he was quite young and in the public eye. He was in the Olympics and everything. Amir Khan, okay? He's a British boxer. There he is with the Union Jack flag, okay? Now, what's his ethnicity is a really interesting question, okay? Normally, if we were in class, we would discuss this, about what ethnicity is Amir Khan. And normally what we end up saying is, well, he's British, he's Asian, okay? We might say he's British Asian or Brasian, and so on. You might also say, well, he's English because he's in a northern English town. So he's not Welsh, he's not Scottish, he's not Irish. Okay, so there's all sorts of different elements there. But what we end up talking about is how he's got a hybrid ethnicity. He's got a blend of several different ethnicities. And probably most of us have a similar, maybe not as many, but a similar blend. So we might be from the UK, but we might also be Welsh, or we might be English, or we might be a mixture. When we trace our family heritage, we might look at our family tree and find out that although we were born in Wales and we think of ourselves as Welsh, maybe a generation or two back, a majority of our ancestors were Irish or English or you know, et cetera, et cetera. So we tend to think of our ethnicity when we actually do explore it as it's quite complex, okay? Now, in education, there's an interesting phenomenon. There is a clear statistical link between your ethnicity and your educational attainment. This goes against all the things that we think should be happening in a school situation. We think that schools should be all about equality of opportunity, everyone having an equal chance. When we look at the results, we see that there is not necessarily an equality of outcome. This might cause us to look again at whether there is equality of opportunity. Okay, if we see a bunch of results that don't seem to reflect what we think should be happening based on what we see in society, it does lead us to come back and say, well, is everyone getting an equal opportunity then? So here we go. This graph shows who gets 5 GCSEs grade A to C, okay? And this graph's actually from quite a while ago. It doesn't matter because it's normally the results are pretty much what you see here. They vary slightly year on year, but this is a very standard distribution. What you can see is that we've broken it down between boys and girls and between different ethnicities. And you'll see white British, white Irish, mixed, Indian, Pakistani, Bangladeshi, Black Caribbean, Black African, other Black, Chinese, any other ethnic group, okay? And what you can see is that some people do better or worse when they're broken down by ethnic characteristics. For example, the people doing the worst on this graph are Black Caribbean boys, okay? As an ethnic group, they are doing almost half as well, or half as badly, if you want to see it as a negative, as, for example, white Irish, okay? Why is that? White Irish boys tend to do twice as well as Black Caribbean boys. What's going on there? Who's doing best among the boys? Well, Chinese boys. Okay, Chinese boys achieving almost a 70% rate of people getting 5 A star to C. All right. But are boys doing as well as girls? No. Okay, so girls are doing far better. And in some cases, the difference between girls and boys when broken down by ethnicity is huge. So if we look at the difference between, for example, white Irish and white British, we'll see that there's about a sort of a 10% gap between boys and girls. When we go down though to look at Black Caribbean boys and girls, we can see that there's a 15% gap there, maybe even tending towards getting on for 20%. Why is there such a gap between, you know, why is there such a difference between ethnic distributions when we break it down? Okay, that's the real conundrum here. And looking at this data, what can we do about it? How can we target, for example, let alone the gender breakdown of boys not doing as well as girls, but how can we target ethnic groups which seem to not be, seem to be underachieving relative to others, and what can we do to maybe lift that ability or achievement up? What's causing it, etc. So questions that we might have: which groups do better than the average white British ethnic group? Okay. Which groups do worse than the average white British ethnic group? And at least 80% of students are white British. How might this affect the patterns? So what happens is, when we go back, let's go back to the graph a second. What this graph doesn't tell us is that the vast majority of students that are accounted for in this graph are in the top two categories: white British, white Irish. Okay, they are the majority of the numbers. And so the other ethnicities are what we would call a minority statistic. Their numbers are not so large. And does that change the way that we view anything? Okay, so that might be quite important. So although Chinese pupils, for example, might be doing a lot better, there aren't that many of them by comparison to the white British and white Irish. Okay. And so that might have an influence on how we see those statistics. So what we look at here is, this is the breakdown of the proportion of people on the right-hand side. You can see these are the proportions of these ethnicities in the population at large, in the 18 to 24 years old bracket. Okay, so it's not the UK population in its entirety. It's just a cross-section of this age group. And what we then see in the column that's in the middle, on the left-hand side of the numbers, is the proportion of that age group that's in higher education. Okay, and what we can do is we can compare the two, and we can say, oh, does higher education, do the proportions of people in higher education, do they match the proportion of people who are in society? Okay, what we find is that white people, white ethnicity, if white is an ethnicity, we can have a discussion about that, tend to be slightly underrepresented in higher education by comparison to the proportion in the population as a whole. Whereas Indian ethnicity is very well represented, overrepresented, if you will, in terms of the number of Indian people in higher education compared to the population as a whole. The same for Pakistani, the same for other Asians, okay, Asian other down there, the same for Chinese, the same for African ethnicity. But some are roughly equal representations of Bangladeshi, Caribbean, and then some are slightly underrepresented. So black other and white, funnily enough, are underrepresented as a statistical percentage. Now you might say, so what? Okay, and you might be right, but some of this might reflect on the statistics that we get to look at. If people are, for some reason, being discouraged from entering higher education, is that going to have some kind of effect? And eventually, is that going to have an effect in society? If some ethnicities are very heavily encouraged to go into higher education, again, is that going to have an effect? And will that have an effect on society at large? In a previous video, so one of the ones that was on YouTube, we looked at A.H. Halsey's notions of equality, and there's two types of equality that Halsey identified. One was equality of opportunity, the idea that we all have equal access to the opportunities available, and the other one was equality of opportunity, which is where we look at the results and we see, do the results match the distributions elsewhere in society? And if we look at that, and if we look at this table here in terms of equality of outcome, these figures should show 92% white in higher education. They should only show 2% Indian in higher education, i.e. we should see people in higher education in roughly the same percentage distributions that we see people in real life, in society, but they're not. And so what we can do is we can ask ourselves, why is this and what effect is this having on our education system? There are other things we need to take into account as well in terms of ethnicity in education. If we look at exclusions, especially permanent exclusions, the rate of permanent exclusions of Black pupils, pupils reporting in Black Caribbean, Black African and Black other ethnic groups in all secondary schools in the UK is 1.1%. And this compares to 0.3% for all other ethnicities. And what we have to say to ourselves is, well, why is that the case? Now, there are two possible avenues of approach on this. One of them is, well, they're being excluded because they're being naughty. So therefore, Black pupils, Black Caribbean, Black African, Black other, they must be more naughty. Okay, because they wouldn't get excluded for nothing, would they? Would be one argument. And another argument might be perhaps the behavior of Black Caribbean, Black African and Black other ethnic groups is being in some way misinterpreted or mistreated such that there's a higher exclusion rate for them. Perhaps Black cultural behavior is being misunderstood or not being dealt with adequately, and so therefore it's leading to a greater number of exclusions. So there's two possible ways of looking at it, which you might say are on a bit of a collision course. But the idea is that, you know, there must be some explanation, okay, and it might be a blend of the two. So we look to see who's done some research into this. So Steve Strand has done some research into this. What we find is that what Strand found was that most ethnic minority groups have, for various reasons, got very high parental and pupil educational aspirations. It's true to say that if you're a newcomer to a country, what we might refer to as a migrant or an immigrant, you're going to start off with less. You're going to start off most of the time with no social network. And you're going to have to sort of establish yourself in your new adopted country. Statistical research shows that it takes about 70 years, that's sort of 3 generations and a bit, before a migrant family has achieved economic equality with the people who live in the new country that they've adopted. So ethnic minority groups working harder, having higher aspirations, might match with this idea of we've got to work hard to establish ourselves here. So most ethnic minority groups have got higher parental and pupil educational aspirations. They've got more positive attitudes to school. They value it. They know how important it is. They also do more homework. Okay, Strand's research showed us this. But Strand's research also showed us that the ethnic minority groups don't get the same rewards as white British pupils, despite this extra effort. So what are they doing then? Are they doing it wrong? Or what's going on? Why are they not getting extra reward for this extra effort? So how do we explain these patterns that we see? So some people have said, well, it's obvious that different ethnic groups have got different levels of intelligence. Okay, so we've got people like Jensen and Watson and their work that's been picked up by new right people like Charles Murray and David Marsland, etc. I think it's Murray's work, The Bell Curve, which talks about IQ levels. And you know, there's a lot of people who are quite happy with the explanation that different ethnicities have different levels of intelligence. There's also some, so this is the Department for Education. Ethnic minorities experience racism in school and society. So this could be something that holds people back educationally. And then Sewell, doing research, found that ethnic minorities have different cultures and values that disadvantage or advantage them. Okay, so if you like, that every culture has a slightly different way of approaching and doing education. So there's all sorts of different ways we can explain these different results in education. If we were going to look and see how can we evaluate it, what we would do is we try and think of one possible argument that supports and one argument that rejects each of those explanations for the underattainment of minority ethnic groups in British schools. Which one would we find most satisfactory and what evidence could we offer? So going back, can we support the idea that different ethnic groups have different levels of intelligence? Well, there's been research into it, and we can see that there are some IQ research differences. But we could counter-evaluate that by saying, well, is IQ just a measure of skill, and therefore that might reflect badly or better depending on an ethnic culture's previous experience with that skill set. Okay, a bit like if you got an elephant and a fish, a monkey and a giraffe, and you said to them to climb a tree. Climbing a tree is a skill. Now, some of those animals are going to have better skill at it than others. Does it mean that the animals that can't climb the tree are not so valid or not so clever? You know, that's the problem here. So the issue then is when we're measuring intelligence, how are we doing it, and what are we actually measuring when we do it? So then we can look at the racism. Okay, so minorities experiencing racism. Okay, we can look at that and we can say yes. Okay, so we can accept it and we can argue about how that has a detrimental effect on people's well-being and in their education. If we're going to oppose it, we might argue that, well, everybody in education and in life and in society experiences some form of discrimination. So, you know, we might say what's different about racism then that makes such a big difference. Now, you could argue that it's intersectional, that racism is on top of all the other discrimination. So other people don't have the racism to contend with, and that the people in ethnic minorities do. And so it's extra burdensome. Okay. And then we can look at the bottom one. Ethnic minorities have got different cultures that advantage or disadvantage them. So they have different cultural approaches. Some people come from cultures where it's a very highly stressful approach to education. So if you're from South Korea or from China or some other Asian countries, the emphasis is very much on children not having much of a social life and being sort of hot-housed in educational, hyper-educational environment until they're 18 or older, so that they can just do the best they can in terms of school. It's all about education, education, education. Whereas in Western cultures, we might not do that, and we might let people have a little bit more of a social life, and we might be a bit more relaxed about education. Okay, so there's different ways we can support and reject these different things. If we were going to write an essay on this, we might write an essay outlining and explaining the relationship between ethnicity and educational attainment. Okay, so that might be something that we get called upon to do at some point in the future. You saw a video, so it's Grace says, she saw a video of a kid getting beaten for only getting 99% on the maths test. Yeah, I mean, you know, we will look at some evidence. You know, South Korea, for example, has an incredibly intense schooling regime, and educational success is almost like the be-all and end-all of life for these kids. And there's a very high suicide rate by comparison to other cultures. You know, the stress is literally too much for some of those kids. And, you know, now I can easily sit here in my different culture and say that that's a bad thing. Someone in a South Korean culture might disagree with me, and they might say, no, you know, this is really important. You know, there's nothing that's more important than this. And we can discuss, you know, our differences in culture. It's not necessarily the case that I'm right and they're wrong, or that they're right and I'm wrong. You know, it's more of a nuanced debate. But that's where we're going to go to and head when we study this in more detail. What we can think about is what points would we make if we were outlining and explaining ethnicity and educational attainment and the link between the two, you know. And so we break that down a little bit more, but that's something we'll come to more in the future. Okay, but hopefully for today, that just gets us thinking a little bit about what possible connection can there be between educational attainment and ethnicity. Certainly, from the statistics that we saw, it looks as though, oops, there is. Okay, so how can this be? How can this be a thing when everybody should be getting an equal opportunity in education? How come we are not seeing this all a lot closer together? Why is there such a wide distribution of academic achievement by ethnicity? Okay, that's a big question for us, and we'll come back to this and look at it in more detail. For today, that's where I want to leave it. Okay, so this is being here. Why are girls doing better? Yeah, I could give you some evidence. Girls mature more at an earlier age. They socialize more, they talk more, and so they're capable of achieving more. This is GCSE, right? Now GCSE traditionally, since its introduction, has incorporated more coursework, and girls tend to do better at coursework, which is a sort of a high level of performance that's sustained over the year. Boys not so much, right? What do boys excel at? Boys tend to do a lot better than girls when we switch to an assessment method, which is like a high stakes one-shot thing. So if you have exams at the end of a year and not coursework all the way through, we find that boys tend to do better than girls. Whether that's something biological or cultural about how we bring up boys and girls differently, I wouldn't like to suggest, but something to do with that. But certainly GCSEs, because there's a high element of coursework, it's not so much now, but even so, girls still do better because of the way that there are modular units. There is still a good chunk of coursework in a lot of subjects, and so on. So girls do better as a result. And I think, a high stakes test at the age of 15 and 16, if girls mature slightly earlier or quite a bit earlier, then probably that's another good explanation for why that might be the case. You're just going to tell me that girls are better than boys, and I'm not going to be able to argue because there's the evidence right in front of us. However, when we get to different age groups, when we get to A-level, when we get to degrees, the story changes again. So it's interesting that this is how it often is at GCSEs. I would say that since their introduction in 1980, what was it, 1986? Can't remember now. The story has been that girls have outperformed boys for 3 decades at GCSE, but not necessarily at A-level all the time, and so on. So, but it's interesting to look at. When we come to do gender and education, does your gender play a part in how well you will do in education? You'll be able to have a field day looking at all this. Okay, right. Thank you very much.